The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Isaiah Merritt decided he would rather walk barefoot to California than let that woman be sold to Silas Boone. It was the spring of 1873, in a dusty crossroads town called Alder Gulch, Wyoming Territory, where the railroad had not yet come, and law was a thing men carried in their holsters more often than in their hearts. Jane Crawford stood on a raised platform outside the feed store, her wrists bound loosely with rope, her chin lifted in a way that told anyone watching she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She was not a slave, not in the way the word had once meant before the war, but a woman sold into indenture by a father who owed more to Silas Boone than he could ever hope to repay in coin, and so had offered his daughter's labor instead, bound for 3 years to whoever paid the debt at auction. It was a practice most decent folks in the territory frowned upon, a leftover shame from harder times, technically legal under the guise of an indenture contract, but rotten to its core, and everyone gathered around the platform knew it, even as they let it happen, because that was simply how things were done when a man could not pay what he owed. Isaiah had ridden into Alder Gulch that morning with nothing more urgent on his mind than buying nails and tobacco. He was 26 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, gray-green and quiet. He had inherited his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's soft heart, though he tried hard to hide the second part beneath a cowboy's practiced indifference. He had not planned on falling in love that day. He had not planned on much of anything, except maybe getting home before dark to feed the horses on the small spread he worked outside of town. But then he saw her. Jane Crawford was 22, with hair the color of wheat left too long in the sun and eyes that flashed defiant blue, even as her father would not meet her gaze from where he stood at the edge of the crowd, ashamed but not ashamed enough to stop what was happening. She wore a plain calico dress, patched at the hem, and she stood straighter than any woman Isaiah had ever seen, as though pride alone could hold her together while the town decided her fate like she was a horse or a plow. Silas Boone, a heavy-set man with a face like spoiled meat, and a reputation for cruelty that stretched from Alder Gulch to the county seat, stood near the front with his thumbs hooked into his vest, grinning like he had already won something. He had wanted Jane for a long while, everyone knew it, had made unwelcome advances at church socials and general store counters, and now he meant to have her the only way she would never willingly give herself, through her father's debt and the law's cold blessing. "Do I hear $10 for the contract?" the auctioneer called, a thin, nervous man named Prout who clearly wanted no part of this but had been given the job because no one else would take it. $10, Silas Boone said, loud and pleased with himself. Isaiah felt something twist hard in his chest, an anger he did not entirely understand yet, mixed up with something else that felt dangerously close to tenderness for a woman he had never spoken a single word to. 15, Isaiah heard himself say. The crowd turned to look at him, and Jane's eyes found his for the first time, wide with surprise and something that might have been the first flicker of hope she had allowed herself all morning. Silas Boone's grin faltered. 20, he growled. Isaiah did not have $20. He did not have $15 if he was honest with himself, not in cash money anyway. He had exactly $6 in his pocket, saved up over 2 months of work at the Lazy K Ranch, and he had come to town intending to spend most of it on supplies. But he had something else, something that suddenly seemed a small price to pay. 25, Isaiah said, and I will throw in my saddle. A murmur ran through the crowd. A good saddle, especially the kind Isaiah rode, a hand-tooled Frazier saddle he had bought used but well cared for, was worth $30 or more on its own, sometimes $40 if the leather was in good condition and the stitching sound. It was, in fact, the most valuable thing Isaiah owned besides his horse itself, and a cowboy without a saddle was like a preacher without his Bible, half a man in the eyes of the world. Silas Boone's face reddened. He was not a poor man, but he was a careful one, and the thought of spending real money he might not need to spend when he could simply wait and try again another day was already working behind his small, mean eyes. "You are a fool, Merritt," he said, but he did not raise the bid. "$25 and a saddle going once," Prout called out, sounding relieved despite himself. "Going twice. Sold to Isaiah Merritt." The crowd broke into scattered applause and scattered mutters of disapproval, for there were those in Alder Gulch who thought Silas Boone had been cheated of something he was owed, and there were those who thought the whole business shameful from the start and were glad to see it end this way instead of the other. Jane Crawford stood on the platform with her bound wrists finally being cut free by Prout's shaking hands, and she looked at Isaiah Merritt as though she did not quite believe he was real. He walked up to the platform, feeling every eye in Alder Gulch on him, and he removed his hat because his mother had raised him to always remove his hat in the presence of a lady, whatever the circumstances of their meeting. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Isaiah Merritt. I do not know you, but I could not stand by and watch what was fixing to happen." Jane's throat worked as she tried to find words. "You gave up your saddle," she said finally, her voice hoarse from a morning of holding back tears she refused to shed in public. "For a stranger. Weren't much of a choice, way I saw it," Isaiah said, and he meant it plainly without any flourish, the way he meant most things. Silas Boone spat near Isaiah's boots as he stalked past, muttering something about fools and their money, but Isaiah paid him no mind. He was looking at Jane Crawford, and she was looking back at him, and something had already begun between them that neither one could yet put a name to. The paperwork was simple enough, a matter of Prout scratching out the transfer of the indenture contract into Isaiah's name instead of Silas Boone's, though Isaiah made it clear, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, that he had no intention of holding Jane Crawford to any 3 years of labor. "This contract is void the moment I sign it," Isaiah said. "I am not buying a servant. I am buying her freedom, plain and simple, and then I am tearing this paper up." He did exactly that, right there in the dusty street, ripping the contract into pieces and letting the wind take them, and something in Jane's chest cracked open with a relief so profound she had to press her hand against her ribs to keep from sobbing right there in front of everyone. Her father, a thin, stooped man named Thomas Crawford, approached hesitantly. "Jane, I am sorry, I did not know what else." "Do not," Jane said, her voice like a closing door. "Do not say anything to me right now, Papa. I cannot hear it." Thomas Crawford's shoulders sagged, and he retreated into the crowd, and Isaiah felt a flash of pity for the man even as he understood Jane's anger, for a father who sold his daughter's labor to cover his own debts, however desperate the circumstances, was a father who had failed in the most basic of duties. Now came the matter of getting home. Isaiah's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Duke, stood tied outside the mercantile, saddleless now, for the Frazier saddle had gone to Silas Boone as part of the bargain, along with the $25, though the older man had taken it with such obvious bitterness that Isaiah almost laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. "I do not have a wagon," Isaiah admitted to Jane, standing beside Duke in the street, "and I gave up my saddle, so riding will be uncomfortable for the both of us, especially you, not being used to it. My place is about 14 miles from here." Jane looked at him, this stranger who had spent everything he had to save her from a fate she did not choose, and something in her chest ached with gratitude so large it frightened her. "I can ride bareback if I must," she said. "I grew up on a farm, Mr. Merritt. I am not made of glass." "I do not doubt it," Isaiah said, and there was the smallest smile at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. "But Duke can carry the both of us at a walk well enough, and I reckon I could use the exercise of walking alongside for a spell myself, to spare his back." And so it was decided, without much more discussion needed, that Jane would ride while Isaiah led Duke on foot, and they set off from Alder Gulch as the sun climbed toward noon, leaving behind the dust and the murmurs and Silas Boone's furious glare, walking toward whatever came next. They did not speak much on that first walk home, both of them too raw from the events of the morning, too uncertain of what words might be appropriate between a man who had just spent his saddle and most of his savings on a woman he had never met, and a woman who had just been spared from 3 years of indenture to a man she despised. But somewhere around the 7th mile, as the prairie grass rippled gold and green in the wind and a hawk circled lazily overhead, Jane broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "You do not know me. You did not have to spend a thing on my account." Isaiah considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, chewing on it a while before answering. "I do not rightly know how to explain it," he said. "I saw you standing up there, and I thought about my sister, God rest her, who died of the fever when she was near your age, and I thought, no woman ought to be sold like cattle, not while I have breath in my body and something to trade. I reckon it was not about knowing you, ma'am. It was about not being able to live with myself if I did nothing." Jane was quiet for a long moment, watching the back of his sun-browned neck as he walked ahead of Duke, leading the horse by a length of rope where the reins would normally be, since the saddle and its attached tack had gone with Sela's boon as well. "I am sorry about your sister," she said softly. "It was a long time ago," Isaiah said. 10 years now, but I still think on her." "What was her name?" "Ruth," Isaiah said. "She would have liked you, I think. She always did favor folks with some grit in them." Jane felt something warm bloom in her chest at that, an unexpected kindness in the midst of a day that had begun with such cruelty. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know saying thank you seems like such a small thing against what you gave up, but I do not know what else to offer." "You do not owe me anything," Isaiah said, turning his head slightly to look up at her where she sat astride Duke's bare back, her skirts hiked awkwardly to allow her to ride properly. "That is the whole point of tearing up that contract. You are a free woman, Miss Crawford, same as anybody." They reached the Lazy K Ranch as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, and Jane saw for the first time the modest cabin Isaiah called home, a 2-room structure of hewn logs with a small barn beside it, and a corral where a handful of other horses grazed. The ranch belonged, Isaiah explained, to an older widow named Martha Kinsley, who owned the land but whose health had failed such that she could no longer manage the cattle herself, and so she employed Isaiah as her foreman, paying him a modest wage and allowing him the use of the smaller cabin on the property. "Mrs. Kinsley is a fair woman," Isaiah said as they approached. "I expect she will not mind you staying a spell until we can sort out what is to become of you. There is a spare room in the main house, I believe, though it has not been used since her husband passed." Jane felt a fresh wave of uncertainty at the thought of what came next. She had no money, no home to return to, for her father's small farm was mortgaged to the bank and would likely be lost within the year regardless of what became of her. She had no family beyond her father, whom she was not yet ready to forgive, and no prospects beyond the kindness of a stranger who had already given so much on her behalf. Martha Kinsley turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and hands gnarled with age but still capable, who listened to Isaiah's account of the day's events with a growing expression of approval. "You did right, Isaiah Merritt," Martha said firmly, once he had finished explaining. "That business with indenture contracts is a disgrace, and everyone in this territory knows it. They simply lack the courage to say so out loud. Of course the girl may stay. I have been meaning to hire some help around the house since my hip started paining me so, and I would rather pay a decent wage to an honest woman than let that room sit empty gathering dust." And so it was settled. Jane would stay at the main house, earning her keep by helping Martha with the cooking and cleaning and mending that had grown difficult for the older woman's aching joints, while Isaiah continued his work as foreman, though now without a saddle to his name. That evening, as Jane helped Martha prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread, she watched through the kitchen window as Isaiah worked in the corral, moving among the horses with an ease that spoke of long practice, though she noticed he moved a bit stiffly, favoring one leg slightly. He walked all those miles today, Martha observed, following Jane's gaze. And he will be walking a good many more, I expect, now that he has given up his saddle. A cowboy without a saddle is a sorry sight around these parts, Miss Crawford. Riding bareback is no way to work cattle, not for any length of time. Jane's heart clenched at this. I did not think of that, she admitted. I was so caught up in my own trouble, I did not consider what it would cost him beyond the money. He will manage, Martha said, though her tone was thoughtful. Isaiah Merritt is not a man who complains about his own hardships, even when he ought to. You would do well to remember that about him, dear. Over the following weeks, Jane came to understand exactly what Martha meant. Isaiah continued his work at the ranch, tending the cattle and mending fences and breaking the occasional wild horse for extra money. But he did all of it now without the comfort and security of a proper saddle. He fashioned a crude substitute from a folded blanket and some rope, but it was a poor thing compared to what he had given up, and Jane noticed how his back ached at the end of long days, how he winced sometimes when he thought no one was watching. She began to feel the weight of his sacrifice more heavily with each passing day, and a fierce determination grew in her to somehow repay what could not truly be repaid. I want to work, she told Martha one morning, about 3 weeks after her arrival, as they sat shelling peas on the porch. Not just here in the house, though I am grateful for the position. I want to earn real wages so that I might save toward buying Mr. Merritt a new saddle. Martha studied her with those sharp eyes for a long moment. You are in love with him, she said, not as a question but as a simple observation of fact. Jane felt her face flush hot. I do not know that I would say that exactly, she stammered. I am grateful to him. I admire him. But love, that seems a great deal to claim after only 3 weeks. Love does not always wait for permission before it takes root, Martha said, with the wisdom of a woman who had buried a husband she had loved dearly for 30 years. But you need not decide today what you feel. Time will tell you soon enough. As for work, I know Sarah Beckett in town is looking for help at her boarding house, if you are serious about earning wages. Jane was serious, and within the week she had arranged to work several days a month at Sarah Beckett's boarding house in Alder Gulch, doing laundry and helping with meals for the boarders, traveling the distance on a mule Martha kept for such purposes, since Duke was needed for ranch work, and there was no thought of taking Isaiah's only horse away from him besides. It was slow, careful work, saving what she could from her wages, but Jane found a strange satisfaction in it, a sense of purpose that had been stripped from her during those humiliating hours on the auction platform. She was, for the first time in her adult life, earning her own way in the world, beholden to no father's debts and no man's whims. Isaiah, for his part, said nothing about the saddle, though Jane suspected Martha had let slip her intentions. For once or twice she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and wonder, as though he could not quite believe a woman would trouble herself so much on his behalf. Their friendship deepened through the summer months, built on small moments rather than grand gestures. Isaiah taught her to ride properly, sitting astride rather than perched awkwardly, using an old blanket saddle he crafted specifically for her lessons, and though she took some tumbles in the soft grass of the corral, she never once cried out or complained, and Isaiah found himself admiring her grit more with each passing lesson. You have a natural seat, he told her one evening, as they walked back toward the house after her lesson, the sun setting in brilliant orange and purple behind the western hills. Most folks take months to learn what you have picked up in weeks. I had a good teacher, Jane said, and there was something soft in her voice that made Isaiah's heart skip in a way he was not entirely prepared for. He found himself thinking of her at odd hours, while mending fence posts or driving cattle from one pasture to another, wondering what she might be doing at that moment, whether she was thinking of him too. He told himself it was foolishness, that a woman like Jane Crawford, educated and proud and full of quiet fire, could have her pick of any man in the territory once word got around of her situation, and that he was simply a foreman with no saddle and modest prospects. But then there were moments, like the evening she brought him a slice of pie she had baked specially, still warm from Martha's oven, and sat with him on the porch steps while he ate it, talking about nothing in particular, the weather and the cattle and a book she had borrowed from Martha's small collection. And in those moments Isaiah allowed himself to hope, just a little, that perhaps she felt something of what he was feeling too. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn brought its own troubles. Silas Boone, it seemed, had not forgotten his humiliation at the auction, nor his desire for Jane Crawford, and he began spreading unpleasant rumors around Alder Gulch, suggesting that Isaiah Merritt had bought Jane not out of chivalry but out of baser motives, and that the two of them were living in sin out at the Lazy K Ranch despite Martha Kinsley's presence as chaperone. The rumors reached Jane one afternoon at the boarding house, delivered with malicious relish by one of the other boarders, and she came home that evening with her jaw tight and her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration. "It's not fair," she said to Isaiah, finding him in the barn where he was mending a bridle by lantern light. "You gave up everything to help me, and now they are twisting it into something ugly." Isaiah set down the bridle and looked at her, his expression grave. "Folks will talk, Jane. They always do, especially about things they do not understand or cannot control. I would not worry too much on Silas Boone's account. He is a bitter man nursing a bitter wound." "But it reflects on you," Jane said. "Your reputation. I would not have that stained on my account, not after everything." "My reputation can bear a little talk," Isaiah said, moving closer to her in the lantern light. "It is yours I worry more about, in a town where women are judged so much more harshly than men for the same circumstances." Jane looked up at him, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray-green eyes, close enough to smell the leather and hay and honest sweat of him. "Isaiah," she said softly, using his given name for perhaps the first time, "do you regret it, what you gave up for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached out, hesitant, and brushed a stray lock of wheat-colored hair back from her face, his rough fingers gentle against her cheek. "I have never regretted a single moment of it," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he could no longer entirely disguise. "Not the saddle, not the walking, not any of it. If anything, Jane Crawford, I regret only that I did not find a way to speak to you sooner, before that terrible day, so that our first meeting might have been under kinder circumstances." Jane's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved, the lantern light flickering between them, the horses shifting quietly in their stalls, the whole world narrowed down to the small space separating their faces. "I think," Jane whispered, "that I have come to care for you a great deal, Isaiah Merritt. More than I rightly know what to do with. I think," Isaiah answered, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I fell in love with you the moment you looked at me from that platform, though I did not have the words for it then." He kissed her then, softly, tentatively, as though asking permission with the gesture itself, and Jane answered by leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her palms. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Jane laughed, a sound of pure, relieved joy that Isaiah had not heard from her before. "Martha said I was in love with you weeks ago," she admitted. "I told her it was too soon to say such a thing." "And now?" Isaiah asked, a smile spreading slow and warm across his weathered face. "Now I think Martha is a very wise woman," Jane said, "and I was a fool to argue with her." They did not rush toward marriage, though the affection between them grew steadily through the remaining months of autumn and into the cold grip of winter. Isaiah wanted to do things properly. He explained one evening, wanted to be able to offer Jane a life of some security and comfort before he asked for her hand, and that meant saving money, rebuilding what he had given up, proving to her and to himself that he could provide for a wife and, God willing, a family of their own someday. Jane understood this desire, respected it even, though there were nights she lay awake in her small room at the main house, wishing simply for the certainty of his name and his ring, wanting the world to know officially what her heart already knew completely. Winter that year was harsh, with heavy snows that made the roads to Alder Gulch nearly impassable for weeks at a time, and Isaiah's work as foreman grew more demanding as he struggled to keep the cattle safe and fed through the brutal cold. Still without a proper saddle, he suffered more than he let on, his back and legs aching from the makeshift blanket rig he used, but he never once complained, not even when Jane pressed him about it directly. "I will manage until spring," he told her. "There is no sense buying a new saddle now, not when every spare dollar ought to go toward seed and supplies for the coming year, and toward the future I hope we might build together." Jane, however, had been saving diligently from her wages at the boarding house, and by the time the spring thaw finally arrived in April of 1874, she had accumulated nearly $18, a sum that filled her with quiet pride even as she recognized it was still short of what a good saddle would cost. It was Martha who provided the solution, in her own practical way. "I have an old saddle in the barn," she told Jane one morning over coffee, "that belonged to my husband before he passed. It has sat unused these 6 years, gathering dust, and it seems to me a foolish waste when Isaiah has need of one and you have the beginnings of the money to make it fit for use again, with some repairs to the leather and stitching." Jane's eyes widened with hope. "Do you think he would accept it? He is a proud man, Martha, and I would not want him to feel it charity." "He will accept it from you," Martha said with the confidence of a woman who had watched their courtship unfold with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Especially if you frame it not as charity, but as a gift between two people who love each other, which I believe is precisely what it would be." And so, on a bright morning in early May, with the prairie grass turning green again and wildflowers beginning to dot the hillsides, Jane presented Isaiah with the saddle, freshly cleaned and repaired by a leatherworker in Alder Gulch using her savings, the old cracks mended and the leather oiled until it gleamed with new life. Isaiah stared at the saddle for a long moment, then at Jane, his throat working with emotion he could not immediately put into words. "Jane," he finally managed, "this is too much. You should not have spent your wages on such a thing." "You spent everything you had on my freedom," Jane said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You walked 14 miles that first day, and every day since for a year now, because you gave up the very thing that made your work easier, all for a stranger you had never met. I could not stand by and watch you continue to suffer for my sake, not when I had the means to help, however small." Isaiah reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the emotion finally broke free, a rough sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or some mixture of both. "I never once thought of it as suffering," he murmured into her hair. "Not when it meant I got to know you, to fall in love with you. But I thank you for this gift, Jane Crawford, more than words can properly say." He saddled Duke that very afternoon, and Jane watched from the porch as he rode out into the pasture, sitting tall and proper in a saddle for the first time in over a year, his relief and joy evident in every line of his posture, and she felt her heart swell with a love so complete it nearly took her breath away. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant colors over the ranch, Isaiah returned to find Jane waiting for him by the corral fence, and he dismounted with a purpose in his stride that told her something significant was about to happen. "Jane Crawford," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, "I have been thinking on this for some months now, waiting until I felt I had enough to offer you properly. But I find I cannot wait any longer, not after what you have done for me today, not after everything we have built together this past year." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small ring, simple silver with a small clear stone that caught the last light of the setting sun, a ring he had been saving toward purchasing for months, using what little extra money he could set aside from his foreman's wages. "I do not have much to offer you," Isaiah continued, his voice thick with emotion but steady with conviction. "A foreman's wage, a small cabin, a saddle that was a gift rather than something I earned myself just yet. But I have a heart that is entirely yours, and I have a determination to build a life with you that grows stronger every single day. Jane Crawford, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Jane's tears came freely now, tears of joy rather than sorrow, and she found herself nodding before she could even form the words. "Yes," she said, then again more firmly. "Yes, Isaiah Merritt, I will marry you. There is nothing in this world I want more than to build a life with you, saddle or no saddle, wealth or no wealth. You gave me my freedom when you owed me nothing, and you have given me your heart every day since. Of course I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and then he kissed her there in the fading light, with Duke nickering softly nearby and the first stars beginning to appear overhead. And Jane thought she had never in her life felt so completely and thoroughly happy. They were married in June of 1874, in a simple ceremony held in the small church in Alder Gulch, with Martha Kinsley serving as matron of honor despite her aching hip, and a good portion of the town turning out to witness the union. For word had spread of their courtship, and most folks, whatever their earlier gossip, had come to see it as a genuinely romantic tale worth celebrating. Even Jane's father attended, standing quietly at the back of the small congregation, and though Jane had not fully forgiven him for the circumstances that had led to her near indenture, she had found it in her heart over the preceding months to at least speak civilly with him again, understanding that desperation sometimes drove good people to poor decisions, without excusing the harm those decisions caused. Silas Boone was notably absent, having grown increasingly bitter over the preceding months as his reputation in the territory soured further with each retelling of the saddle story, which had become something of a local legend, whispered admiringly among the young women of the county, and grudgingly respected even by the rougher cowboys who might otherwise have mocked such open sentiment. Some months after the wedding, Silas Boone would sell his holdings and move on to try his fortunes elsewhere, unable to bear the weight of a community's quiet disapproval, though this departure caused little sorrow among the residents of Alder Gulch. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt, conducted by a circuit preacher named Reverend Aldous Finch, who traveled between several small territorial towns holding services and performing marriages as needed. Jane wore a dress of pale blue cotton that Martha had helped her sew over several evenings, simple but elegant, with small pearl buttons Martha had saved from her own wedding dress decades before. Isaiah wore his one good suit, pressed carefully, his hair combed neatly for perhaps the first time anyone in town could recall. When Reverend Finch pronounced them husband and wife, Isaiah kissed his new bride with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one eye among the gathered witnesses, and the small church erupted in applause and cheerful shouts as the couple made their way back down the aisle, now bound together for whatever life might bring them. Martha Kinsley, true to her generous nature, gifted the young couple a small parcel of her land as a wedding present, enough acreage to build their own modest cabin and begin raising a small herd of cattle of their own, in addition to Isaiah's continued work as her foreman. It was not a fortune by any means, but it was a start, a foundation upon which they could build their shared future, and both Isaiah and Jane approached the work of establishing their new home with the same quiet determination that had characterized their courtship. They built the cabin themselves that first summer, with help from several neighbors who had come to respect and admire the young couple's story, felling timber and hauling stone for the foundation, working long days beneath the hot prairie sun. Jane proved as capable with an axe and hammer as she was with needle and thread, insisting on doing her share of the physical labor despite Isaiah's initial protests that such work was not fitting for a lady. "I told you before," she reminded him one afternoon, wiping sweat from her brow as she helped notch a log for the cabin walls. "I am not made of glass, Isaiah Merritt. This is our home we are building. I intend to have a hand in every part of it." Isaiah, who had learned by then that arguing with his wife on matters of her own capability was generally a losing proposition, simply smiled and handed her another tool, grateful beyond measure for a partner who approached life with such fierce independence and shared purpose. By autumn of that first year of marriage, their cabin stood complete, small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace Isaiah had built himself and windows that Jane had insisted upon, real glass panes ordered specially from a supplier in Cheyenne, so that light could fill their home even in the depths of winter. They moved in together as the first frost touched the prairie grass, and that first night in their own home, lying together before the fire Isaiah had built, Jane found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked him, her head resting against his chest as they lay together on the simple bed frame Isaiah had constructed. "The auction, I mean. How different everything might have turned out." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her hair. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly I think about how close I came to simply riding into town for nails and tobacco, minding my own business, and never knowing what I would have missed. It frightens me more now than it did then, the thought of what might have been." "Silas Boone," Jane said quietly, unable to keep a small shudder from passing through her at the memory of his cold, calculating eyes on the auction platform. "He cannot hurt you now," Isaiah said firmly, pulling her closer against him. "He is gone from these parts, and even if he were not, I would not let any harm come to you, not while I have breath in my body." "I know," Jane said, and she did know it, felt it in the steady strength of his arms around her, in the quiet confidence of his voice. "I am not frightened of him anymore, not really. I simply think of how grateful I am that you were the kind of man who could not ride past injustice without doing something about it, even at such cost to yourself." "It was no true cost," Isaiah said, "not when I consider what I gained in return." Their first winter together as husband and wife passed peacefully, filled with the small domestic joys of building a shared life, and by the time spring arrived again in 1875, Jane discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled both of them with a joy so profound it seemed to color every aspect of their daily lives with fresh meaning, and Isaiah found himself working even harder to expand their small herd of cattle, wanting to ensure security for the family they were building. Martha Kinsley, delighted at the prospect of what she considered practically a grandchild, insisted on teaching Jane everything she knew about childbirth and infant care, having raised 3 children of her own before losing 2 to illness in their childhood years, a sorrow she carried quietly, but which made her all the more determined to help Jane through her pregnancy with as much wisdom and support as she could offer. The pregnancy progressed without serious complication through that spring and summer, though Jane found herself increasingly tired as her time drew near, and Isaiah took to completing many of her usual chores himself in addition to his own work, rising before dawn to ensure everything was managed properly, wanting his wife to rest as much as possible. "You do not need to do everything yourself," Jane told him one evening in early autumn, watching him prepare supper after a long day of ranch work, his movements showing the fatigue of doing double duty around their home and land. "I want to," Isaiah said simply. "You are carrying our child, Jane. The least I can do is see that you are comfortable and well cared for." Their first child, a son, was born in October of 1875, on a crisp, clear morning, with the aspens turning gold on the distant hillsides. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through most of a day and into the evening, with Martha Kinsley attending as midwife alongside a doctor summoned from Alder Gulch when complications arose partway through. Isaiah paced outside their cabin for hours, unable to bear witnessing his wife's pain but equally unable to leave the vicinity, praying with an intensity he had not felt since his sister Ruth's death a decade before. When the cry of a newborn infant finally pierced the evening air, Isaiah felt something break open in his chest, relief and joy so overwhelming he had to lean against the cabin wall to steady himself. Martha emerged a few minutes later, her face tired but wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Isaiah Merritt," she said, "and your wife is doing well though tired from her efforts. Come meet your boy." Isaiah entered the cabin to find Jane propped up in their bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth against her chest. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and Jane looked up at him with an expression of such profound love that his breath caught in his throat. "He has your eyes," Jane said softly, tilting the bundle so Isaiah could see the infant's face, scrunched and red but unmistakably alert, with eyes that already showed hints of the gray-green color that marked his father. "What shall we name him?" Isaiah asked, settling carefully onto the edge of the bed, afraid to disturb mother or child in this fragile, precious moment. Jane had clearly given this thought during the long months of her pregnancy. "I would like to call him Thomas," she said, "after my father. I know things between us have been strained, but he has tried these past months to make amends in whatever small ways he can, and I think perhaps it is time to extend a measure of forgiveness, for our son's sake if nothing else." Isaiah nodded, understanding the significance of this gesture, the way it represented Jane's own healing from the wounds of her past. "Thomas Merritt," he said, testing the name aloud. "I think that suits him well. And perhaps his middle name might honor someone else important to us. Ruth, if we ever have a daughter, but for now, what would you think of Thomas Wade after my own father?" "Thomas Wade Merritt," Jane repeated, smiling down at their son. "I think that is perfect." Thomas Crawford, when he learned of his grandson's name, wept openly, and the gesture began a slow but genuine reconciliation between Jane and her father, one that would deepen over the following years as Thomas proved himself changed by the shame of his earlier actions, working hard to rebuild trust with his daughter, and to become a doting grandfather to young Thomas Wade and the children who would follow. Life on the small ranch continued to flourish over the following years. Isaiah's herd grew steadily, supplemented by his continued work as Martha's foreman, and by 1878 he had saved enough to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property, expanding their operation into a proper working ranch of their own, separate from those still cordially connected to Martha's holdings. Martha herself, now approaching 70, had grown to consider Jane and Isaiah as much her family as any blood relation, and she doted on young Thomas Wade with the fierce affection of a grandmother, teaching him to ride his first pony and telling him stories of the early territorial days when Wyoming had been wilder and less settled than the relatively established community it was becoming. In 1877, Jane gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Ruth Ellen, honoring both Isaiah's late sister and Jane's own mother who had passed some years before Jane's marriage. Ruth Ellen proved to be a spirited child from her earliest days, inheriting her mother's stubborn independence and her father's quiet determination, and she would grow into a young woman who insisted on learning to ride and rope alongside her older brother, much to the amusement and pride of both her parents. A third child followed in 1880, another son they named Isaiah Jr., though he was called Ike by the family to distinguish him from his father, and by the time Ike arrived, the Merritt Ranch had become one of the more respected operations in the county, known for the quality of its cattle and the fair dealing of its owners, a far cry from the desperate circumstances that had first brought Isaiah and Jane together. Throughout these years of building their family and their ranch, Isaiah and Jane's love for each other only deepened, weathering the ordinary trials of frontier life, the harsh winters and dry summers, the occasional illness that swept through the territory, the constant hard work required to maintain a successful ranch operation. They faced these challenges together, as true partners, each drawing strength from the other in ways that had been evident even in those early days of their courtship. The saddle Jane had given Isaiah on that spring morning in 1874 remained in use for many years, carefully maintained and repaired as needed, until eventually it was retired to a place of honor in their barn, replaced by a newer saddle purchased once their ranch had become sufficiently prosperous. But Isaiah never forgot what that original gift had meant, the sacrifice Jane had made to ease his own earlier sacrifice, and he often told the story to their children as they grew, a family legend that reminded them all of the power of love freely given and generously returned. "Your mother," he would tell young Thomas Wade and Ruth Ellen and later Ike as well, gathered around the fire on winter evenings, saved every penny she earned at that boarding house for nearly a year, just so I would not have to keep working without proper equipment. That is the kind of woman your mother is. Never forget it. "And your father," Jane would counter, her eyes soft with old affection as she looked across the fire at her husband, "gave up everything he owned to save a stranger from a terrible fate, expecting nothing in return. That is the kind of man your father is." Their children grew up hearing this story so many times that it became woven into the very fabric of their family identity, a testament to the values their parents hoped to instill in them: courage in the face of injustice, generosity even at personal cost, and above all, the transformative power of love freely given. By 1885, more than a decade after that fateful auction in Alder Gulch, the Merritt Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 2,000 acres, with a proper ranch house that had replaced their original small cabin, though Isaiah had insisted on preserving the original structure as a kind of monument to their humble beginnings, using it eventually as a bunkhouse for the ranch hands they had come to employ as their operation expanded. Martha Kinsley lived to see all three of the Merritt children grow into their teenage years, passing peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1886 at the age of 81, having lived long enough to know that her faith in Isaiah Merritt's character, expressed so plainly on that first day when Jane arrived at her ranch, had been entirely justified. She left her remaining land and holdings to Isaiah and Jane in her will, having no children of her own surviving, and the Merritt family mourned her passing as they would have mourned a beloved grandmother, for that was precisely the role she had come to fill in their lives. Jane's father, Thomas Crawford, also lived to see his grandchildren grow, and though the early wound of his betrayal never fully healed, he found genuine redemption in his relationship with them, teaching young Thomas Wade to fish in the creek that ran through the Merritt property and sharing stories of the early territorial days that fascinated all three grandchildren. He passed away in 1889, and Jane found she was able to grieve him with genuine love, the anger of her youth having long since given way to understanding and forgiveness. As for Silas Boone, word occasionally reached Alder Gulch of his fortunes elsewhere, none of it particularly favorable, and eventually the story simply stopped coming altogether, his name fading from local memory except as a cautionary footnote to the more celebrated tale of Isaiah Merritt's saddle and the walking that had followed. The story of how Isaiah Merritt had sold his saddle to buy Jane Crawford's freedom and walked home on foot for the better part of a year rather than spend money on a replacement he could not yet afford, spread throughout the territory over the years that followed their marriage, told and retold at social gatherings and around campfires, gaining small embellishments here and there as such stories often do, but retaining always its essential truth: that a man had given up something precious to save a woman from injustice, expecting nothing in return, and that love had grown from that sacrifice into something lasting and beautiful. Young cowboys courting their sweethearts in the years that followed would sometimes invoke the tale as an example of true devotion, and more than one young woman in the territory found herself comparing potential suitors against the standard set by Isaiah Merritt's willing sacrifice, much to the occasional frustration of those suitors who felt they could never quite measure up to such a romantic legend. Isaiah himself remained somewhat embarrassed by the local fame the story brought him, preferring to think of himself simply as a man who had done what seemed right in a difficult moment, rather than as any kind of romantic hero. But he never denied the story when asked about it, and he always finished the telling with the same observation, that whatever he had given up that day paled entirely in comparison to what he had gained in Jane Crawford's love and partnership. Jane, for her part, grew into her role as a respected rancher's wife and mother, with the same quiet strength and determination that had characterized her from that very first day on the auction platform. She never forgot the humiliation of that morning, the fear and shame of being sold like property, but she transformed that painful memory into a fierce advocacy for other women in similar circumstances, using her family's growing influence in the territory to speak out against the practice of indenture contracts, which were gradually being outlawed across the Western territories as attitudes shifted and reformers pushed for stronger protections for vulnerable women and children. By the time Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, the practice that had nearly condemned Jane to years of servitude had been formally abolished throughout the territory, and Jane took quiet satisfaction in knowing that her own painful experience had contributed, in whatever small way, to protecting other young women from similar fates. Their children grew and eventually established families of their own. Thomas Wade Merritt took over increasing responsibility for the ranch as his father aged, marrying a young woman named Emily Hutchins from a neighboring ranch family in 1895, and together they would eventually take full ownership of the Merritt Ranch as Isaiah and Jane grew older, though the elder Merritts remained active in ranch life well into their later years. Ruth Ellen Merritt, true to her spirited nature, surprised her family by choosing to attend a teacher's college in Cheyenne, rather than immediately settling into married life, becoming one of the first women in the county to pursue formal education for a professional career. She eventually returned to Alder Gulch to teach at the local school, marrying a shopkeeper named Daniel Whitfield in 1898, and their union produced several children who would grow up hearing their grandmother Jane's stories of frontier hardship and their grandfather Isaiah's tale of the sacrificed saddle with the same wonder and pride that Thomas Wade and Ruth Ellen herself had once felt. Ike Merritt, the youngest, proved to have inherited his father's gift with horses, eventually establishing his own smaller ranch nearby specializing in breeding quality horses for ranch work, and eventually for the growing interest in rodeo competitions that emerged in the territory during the 1890s. He married a young woman named Louisa Pemberton in 1902, and their descendants would continue ranching in the region well into the following century. As Isaiah and Jane Merritt entered their later years, their love for each other remained as strong and evident as it had been in those early days of courtship, tempered now by decades of shared experience, joy, and occasional hardship, but no less genuine for having weathered the tests of time. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1904 with a large gathering of family and friends at the ranch, including their children and by then several grandchildren, and Isaiah rose to give a toast that brought tears to the eyes of everyone gathered. 30 years ago, he said, raising his glass, I walked 14 miles leading a horse because I had given up my saddle to buy freedom for a woman I had never met. I did not know then that I was walking toward the greatest blessing of my life. Jane Crawford Merritt, you have been my partner, my love, and my dearest friend for 30 years, and I would walk that same 14 miles 1,000 times over if it meant I would find you waiting for me at the end of the journey. Jane, sitting beside him with tears streaming freely down her weathered but still beautiful face, rose to embrace her husband before the assembled family, and the applause that followed echoed the same warmth and approval that had greeted their wedding announcement 3 decades before. They lived out their remaining years together in contentment, watching their family grow and prosper, occasionally telling their story to newcomers in the region who had not yet heard the local legend of the saddle and the year of walking that had preceded such a lasting and beautiful love. Isaiah passed away peacefully in 1912, at the age of 65, with Jane by his side holding his hand. And though her grief was profound, she found comfort in the knowledge that they had shared a love so complete and so well-lived that few couples in any era could claim its equal. Jane herself lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, remaining active in the ranch's operations as an advisor even as her son Thomas Wade managed the daily affairs. And she often told the story of the saddle to her great-grandchildren as they came along, wanting them to understand the values their family had been built upon: courage, sacrifice, and above all, a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle placed before it. She passed away in 1920 at the age of 69 and was buried beside Isaiah in a small cemetery overlooking the ranch they had built together from such humble and dramatic beginnings. Their headstones, simple granite markers, bore matching inscriptions that their children had chosen together, wanting to honor the story that had defined their parents' remarkable love. Isaiah's stone read, "He gave up everything to save her and found everything worth having in return." Jane's stone read, "She gave him her heart, for he had already given her his freedom." The Merritt Ranch continued in family hands for generations following, a testament to the foundation Isaiah and Jane had built together, and the story of the saddle sold for freedom, and the year of walking that had followed, remained a cherished piece of family history and regional folklore. Told and retold whenever the topic of true love and genuine sacrifice arose among the descendants of that remarkable couple who had found each other under such unlikely and difficult circumstances in the spring of 1873, in a dusty crossroads town called Alder Gulch, in the wild and untamed territory that would eventually become the state of Wyoming. Their love story, born from an act of profound sacrifice and nurtured through years of shared hardship and joy, stood as proof that even in a world often marked by injustice and cruelty, there existed the possibility of genuine goodness, of people willing to give everything they had for the sake of another's freedom and dignity. It was a story that reminded all who heard it that love, true love, often asked everything of those who possessed it and gave back immeasurably more in return. And so it was that Isaiah Merritt, who had once walked 14 miles leading a saddleless horse rather than see an injustice go unanswered, found in that single act of courage and compassion not just a wife, but a partner for life, a family that would carry forward his values for generations, and a love story that would be told and retold as long as there were those in the territory who valued tales of genuine heroism, quiet sacrifice, and the transformative power of love, freely given without expectation of return. The wild grasses still grow tall on the hills overlooking what remains of the old Merritt Ranch, and though the original cabin has long since fallen to ruin, replaced by more modern structures over the succeeding decades, there are still those in the region who, passing by on horseback or in later years by automobile, will pause to remember the story of the saddle, the year of walking, and the love that grew from an act of pure and selfless courage in the spring of 1873. It remains, to this day, one of the most cherished tales of the old territorial days, a reminder that even in the harshest of times and places, love finds a way to bloom, and that sometimes the greatest romances begin not with grand declarations, but with a single selfless act that changes the course of two lives forever.